few words on the Inverness City Heritage Trust, because I'm aware that not everyone knows what we do. And in fact, one couple here was told that we'd actually stopped completely. We haven't. But we were actually launched in May 2005. And in the 18 years since then, we've actually assisted over 250 projects in the historic environment of Inverness, delivering 2.7 million of Historic Environment Scotland grant funding, no mean feat. And that has varied from, I remember in the very early years, we were actually doing residential buildings and commercial properties in the two conservation areas, Crown and Riverside. And then we've also sort of helped fund work into Welfare Hall, Northern Meeting Park, and the current WASPs building that we're currently in. And I know many of us here remember this from our old days when it was the Inverness Royal Academy. So we're in the old gym at this moment in time. Now, we're very much instrumental in the Academy Street Townscape Heritage Scheme, and that was working with the Highland Council. And in that scheme, we did a total investment of 4.3 million, and out of that, about 1.75 million came in grant funding, some from Historic Environment Scotland through the Inverness City Heritage Trust, also the National Lottery Fund and the Highland Council. And I think it's made a huge difference to Academy Street. There's still more we'd like to do, but you can't always get all owners to buy into it and to put some of their own money into the buildings as well. So there's still work to be done. But since it's that completion of that project in 2021, we've had to regroup. And in fact, we've got 3 new trustees. It was getting quite lonely. I was the only one at one point. And we've actually developed a new strategy and business plan. And that's going to take us forward, hopefully, for the next few years. And this was done in consultation with local and national stakeholders to assess what the current needs, opportunities, and challenges there are to the heritage environment in Inverness. Now, that business plan has now gone to Historic Environment Scotland for their approval and hopefully full funding. And the aim is to actually start work on delivering it in April 2024, when we hope to have a new full-time employee on board. And it's mainly going to focus on supporting local community groups with their built heritage projects, those buildings at risk, promoting building maintenance, key item, and climate resilience, and educating young people on traditional skills. We've had quite a lot of success in the past. Alison's had a lot of success with the evenings she's done for local homeowners in old buildings and for craftsmen and stonemasons, etc., in the area. So we want to be able to continue that work on because it's key. But as always, the City Heritage Trust will always be there to sort of influence the Inverness's and represent Inverness's heritage voice, advocating and advising on the built heritage of the city. Now, I'd just like to finish, because this is in memory of Brian Longmore, by saying a few words on Brian. Now, Brian was a trustee from its inception in 04-05, and he brought not only his immense legal skills to the board, but also his love of the built environment. I joined in 2007, and over the years, Brian always came to meetings and he had that key question or that issue that he wanted to raise, and he always had a relevant piece of paper. And I remember saying to him, how many files do you have at home on City Heritage Trust? And he said, no, not many, but he still had kept every single key paper. I should have done law, I think. So there we go. But he was sharp as a tack right to the end. And it really was, we were very, very sad when we heard of his sudden death. And it was really quite a loss to many people, but also particularly to the Trust. So we're delighted that many of Brian's family are here tonight and friends, and we'd like to welcome you warmly. And thank you for attending. Thank you. Now, just before I hand over to Calum, I'd just like to say we are looking for more trustees. There are only 4 of us. So if anyone has skills in HR, communications and marketing, then and obviously a love of the built heritage, that goes without saying, do contact one of us. But before you all rush, this is quite a hands-on role. There is work to be done. So, but do come and see either myself, or at the back there we've got Craig and Glyn, who are both standing up currently, and Calum as well. And now I'd just like to hand over to Calum, who's going to talk about Alexander Ross and the Making of Inverness. So please welcome Calum Maclean.
When we look at Inverness today, perhaps we don't really fully appreciate just how big an impact Alexander Ross had on the town. So many of his buildings have been lost, so many of his buildings have changed, so many other buildings have been built around them, crowding them out sometimes. But we need to maybe take a step back in time and just see what people of Inverness thought at the time. If we rewind to 1904, when Ross was approaching the twilight of his career, when his buildings were still fresh, newly built, unaltered, we start to get a feel for the appreciation and the affection that the townfolk held for Alexander Ross and his work. The Inverness and District Trades Federation held a dinner at the Palace Hotel to honour Ross, and in his address, the president of the Federation, William MacDonald, made the following remarks. During the 50 years in which he has been engaged in business, he has come into contact with all sorts and conditions of men, and as to relations with them. And it is sufficient to say that there are few who have made more friends among all classes of men than he has. As to the extent of his operations, there is perhaps no other man to this day who has left his mark so strongly on the north of Scotland. One may well say of Dr. Ross, as was said of one great architect, if you desire to see my monument, just look around. This description of Ross and his comparison with Christopher Wren has stuck around and has been often repeated over the years. I'd like to thank Angus McCall for giving us permission to use this painting, which was done by Alexander Ross. It shows Alexander Ross's more poetic and romantic side. You'll see that it's not a perfect vision of Inverness, because Ben Wyvis has moved across rather romantically. And you also note that it's taken from a vantage point which is probably about 30 feet above the river. So he was a very creative person. In 1850, Ross was completing his studies at Inverness Royal Academy, and in his final year, he won the prize for painting. And he continued painting throughout his career, and he has many wonderful sketchbooks and watercolours to his name. This is the Inverness Royal Academy that Alexander Ross would have known, down in the centre of Academy Street. And we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later. But before entering the profession as a young man in his father's practice, just before the railways arrived, Inverness wasn't a very big town at all. You can see that there's a dense cluster and warren of back courts and lanes, but in essence, Inverness was little more than 4 streets. Bridge Street and High Street, running across down to the bridge, and we have Church Street running from the castle up to the Old High, and we have Castle Street coming down the side of the castle. Academy Street then, as Alexander Ross said, was practically built in the country. In his days, the early days, and those of Sir Henry MacAndrew, the Academy Street was almost deserted of traffic. The whole fields behind were free and open from the Academy to the sea. In this dense warren of streets, it was quite medieval in character. Densely packed tenements with small courtyards in the back, providing access to the stairs up to the various apartments. The west side of the river was largely undeveloped. Joseph Mitchell described that part of the town. He said in his memoirs, "The town on the west side of the river consisted then mainly of wretched little cottages or huts, occupied by peasantry or working people, many of them employed on the Caledonian Canal." This is a photograph of Chisholm's Close, now where King Street is. At that time it was called Mill Lead Lane. This photograph would have been taken in the 1890s, and you can still see that the cottages were thatched. No chimneys, just a hanging lum in the centre of the roof. So they were not very comfortable. and they wouldn't have provided a good quality of life to the people who lived in them. So here is Inverness as it was when Alexander Ross started his career in architecture in 1850. You can see the castle picked out in red and the old high church. These were the main waypoints in the town, the main landmarks. Church Street running between the two. Bridge Street and the High Street. And then at the very back there you can see Academy Street out in the countryside. Ross's entry into the profession of architecture was marked by personal tragedy. His father died aged 46 in 1853, leaving the 19-year-old in a very precarious position. His future was by no means certain. He was partway through his training and he had little or no experience. But valiantly, he posted this notice in the Inverness Courier saying that he would continue his father's business and hope to earn a living in the process. It was at this moment that Ross's path crossed that of Bishop Eden, and that would be instrumental in the shaping of his career. Eden had recently arrived in Inverness, but it wasn't perhaps in the most fortuitous of circumstances. He had alienated quite a large part of the congregation who had expected another local minister to have taken up the position of bishop, and he had moved the seat of the diocese from Elgin to Inverness, which had upset further people. Ross was part of Bishop Eden's congregation, and Bishop Eden was astute, and he was able to see that there was an opportunity here not only to show compassion and to help out a young member of his congregation, but it was also a chance for him to build a bridge to his congregation and to show that there was more that he could offer than just a power struggle in the town. And he offered, there's Bishop Eden, he offered Alexander Ross his first commission, St Ninian's Church down in Glen Urquhart. It was a very modest budget. You can see from the building it's got heather thatch, very small. The stone was robbed from another building nearby. Very little budget, but it was no risk to Bishop Eden. It was out in the middle of nowhere. If the project didn't go well, nobody would know about it. But if the project did go well, then he could claim a lot of credit. It went very well. It got a good review in the press. The people who visited it said that it was a great example of fine architecture on a small budget, showed great creativity. Having produced one project, Bishop Eden felt confident enough to give him another project and another project. And slowly, step by step, project by project, Alexander Ross started to build the foundations of his practice. In uncanny circumstances in 1857, a Dingwall architect called Alexander Messer passed away, leaving a very young family. Ross was invited to take over Messer's practice, and in the process came into contact with his perhaps most enduring and high-profile client, Alexander Matheson. Alexander Matheson was perhaps one of the most wealthy and influential businessmen in the north of Scotland, having made a fortune in the Far East. And he was instrumental in buying many, many estates in Rossshire and also here in Inverness. He was a leading backer of the railways, which would transform the fortunes of Inverness, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later on. The railways, when they arrived, are highlighted in orange up at the top in 1853. Firstly, with a link to Nairn. A few years later, that was extended across to Aberdeen. And then in 1863, the link to Perth. And we just have to look at the transformation that took place immediately after. One of the first commissions that was started was the creation of Union Street. And here we can see the buildings that are starting to emerge that were commissioned for Alexander Ross. We have 46 to 48 Union Street. We have the public music hall. There was a church, St John's Church, that was built on Union Street. It is now Barclays Bank. Then we move on a little bit further to a warehouse at the back of Balham-Taylor Street. Some more development that took place. Alexander Ross did some work on the Station Hotel, and he also did some work on the Caledonian Hotel. It was part of a collaboration. Alexander Ross was still very young at this stage, but it proved that he was able to take on these big public projects. And working with a couple of other architects in the town, they built the first modern street through the centre of Inverness. I'll come back and I'll look at these in a little bit more detail, but I just want to show a few more of the buildings that Alexander Ross was involved in. So all of these ones that are coloured are the work of Alexander Ross. There's Queensgate there. There's the Foundry down Academy Street. The Free North Church. There's another block of buildings up on Church Street, just for commercial clients. There's the British Linen Bank. The characteristics of his work in the New Town were cool classicism, rational, all about business, all about the way we deal with our everyday transactions. When the railway arrived, people quickly realised that the High Street and Bridge Street were pretty run down. They were old medieval streets. They weren't very attractive. At this time, estates across the Highlands were being bought up by wealthy industrialists and landowners who were building shooting lodges and bringing their friends up from the south to enjoy the summer season, shooting, fishing, and there was very little for them to do when they arrived. So a group of enterprising businessmen decided to get together, buy up all the little parcels of land, and create this new street that would link the railway line and bring it through to Church Street with a series of boutique shops, high-end shops, luxury shops, that would encourage these people to spend their money in Inverness before quickly getting on the next train to the countryside. Here we see Union Street back in the day. We have 46 to 48 Union Street, which was a block of commercial offices built by Alexander Ross. In the centre, slightly paler yellow colour, we have the public hall, which was a competition which involved the other architects in the town. They all had to come up with a design for the hall, and Alexander Ross was able to demonstrate his skill and his artistic flair, winning the competition with quite a clever design, which we shall have a look at here. So here's an old photograph from the George Washington Wilson collection. Anybody who knows Inverness will know that that is now a snooker hall. A very unfortunate loss to the town. It would have been a fantastic building. It looks beautiful, and the new building doesn't compare. Very inspired by French classical architecture of the period, and we start to see Alexander Ross looking to the continent for his ideas. He was an architect that was based in the Highlands, but he had a European outlook. He was progressive, he was very modern, he would soak up new ideas and take on board as many of them as he could, because he was very much interested in the modern ways of doing things. Himself and Alexander Matheson understood that if the Highlands was to thrive and survive, they needed to embrace new technology and all the opportunities that afforded. Here's the view of the Caledonian Hotel. The front and the back, this beautiful garden, ballroom at the back overlooking the river. The Mercure Hotel just doesn't compare. Another important client of Alexander Ross's was Aeneas Mackintosh, who had the Longmore estate. He had a lovely, beautiful, stately home up there, which unfortunately is now demolished, and Longmore Hospital now sits on the grounds. But Aeneas Mackintosh was another prominent landowner in the centre of the town. He saw the success of Union Street, and he had a parcel of land of his own. I don't know if you can read that on the screen up there, but you'll see A.L. Mackintosh in the centre of that red box. He owned that piece of land, and he saw how successful the Union Street development had been, and he started to buy up parcels of land quietly. Every time a piece came up, he'd buy it secretly, until gradually he had acquired enough land to develop this wonderful new street that essentially copied the same model as Union Street. This is the corner of Academy Street as we enter into Queensgate. These two buildings, both by Alexander Ross, mark the entrance. And as we get in to the centre of the street, we find this beautiful wide boulevard. Alexander Ross was very much inspired by the Parisian boulevards that were being built by Haussmann at the same period. And he'd actually been over to do a study tour in Paris and come back with all these wonderful ideas. And you'll see the blocks here have got this wonderful continental feel to them, with the balconies, the French windows at first floor level that you can open out and get onto the balconies. This is the only building of the period that had French windows in the whole of the north of Scotland. It was quite unusual and very, very modern. Allowed people to open up their living spaces onto the street, allow the air and the light into the building. So here's what Haussmann was doing at exactly the same time. And this had inspired Alexander Ross. And you can see the similarities with the arches on the ground floor, the balconies, the mansard roof. It's very much all about Inverness as being a European modern city looking forward to a bright future. The composition of the street was very grand and really ambitious in terms of what they could offer the city. And here we are today, in a pattern that Alexander Ross followed regularly throughout his career. He would take a stake in the development. So on the corner here, on the first floor level, that was Alexander Ross's office. So when the development opened, he moved from his office, which was in Union Street, in one of the blocks he'd just finished there, and said, okay, right, I'm going to move over here and take a stake in this new development. Beautiful detail, lots of exciting stuff to see. The closer you get to these buildings, the more you can find to attract your interest. And this idea of kind of giving something to people, either in the terms of just beauty and decoration, or also a bit of sense of humour. So throughout Alexander Ross's work, you can occasionally find an odd joke, an odd visual reference that perhaps maybe only the people of Inverness might appreciate or understand. The beautiful Rose Street Foundry, full of craftsmanship. This is getting towards the end of Alexander Ross's career, and his business was so successful that he became a major shareholder in the Rose Street Foundry itself. So again, he was invested in what was going on. And with all of the beautiful craftsmanship and the decoration in this building, we can see that he had a real respect and dignity for the people who built his buildings. And that's reflected maybe in the comments that William MacDonald made during the dinner to celebrate his 50 years in business. Rose Street Foundry has got a steel frame behind the facade, and this was real cutting-edge technology. Structural steel for use in the construction industry has only just started to come into the market, and Alexander Ross embraced it. He was at the forefront of it. It made this beautiful, clear floor plate inside with these wonderful skylights that came through. And in fact, when this photograph was taken, you can see that the floor is boarded over, but there were atriums that brought the light flooding through the building right the way through to the ground floor. So this was something that was completely revolutionary to the community at the time. They would never have seen anything as daring or as modern as this, and it would have been quite a delight. The mosaics at the top show again how Alexander Ross was keen. He wasn't just about building buildings, he was about giving something to the community, a bit of decoration, something that celebrated the work that they did. And there's a sequence of murals across the building which celebrate the process of making iron, turning it into the products that were used across the country. Again, we've got these wonderful caricatures put on the building. I'm sure they are a caricature of somebody who's involved in the foundry. I don't know who, but I'm sure they are. The British Linen Bank, more wonderful sculptures, these beautiful heads that poke out of the columns, again give us this wonderful flourish. If we look close enough, there's always something there to see. The closer you get to the building, it gives more and more and more to you. And the wonderful, wonderful station hotel. So the station hotel was originally built by Matthews and Laurie in the 1864 when the train first arrived. But Alexander Ross took what the building had and he carved out a completely new interior from the existing building. All of these entrance foyer area, the columns, the whole new staircase and the atrium in the centre of the building was all Alexander Ross's work. The Inverness Courier wrote when it opened, "One has frequent reason to admire the artistic talent with which an old structure, by a few deft strokes of the designer's pencil, may be transformed in appearance and immensely improved in utility. The latest example of this happy result is seen at the Station Hotel. The external good looks which have been improved, whilst internally the wide expanse of floor space has been rescued from a desert of lobby, and the wearied feet of generations of guests and waiters will be saved no end of miles walking." So we looked at the town centre and the modern streets he brought to the medieval town. He did something similar, if not on an even grander scale, over on the west side of the river. Alexander Matheson had been acquiring all of the estates on the west side of the river as they came onto the market, piece by piece. For 10 years, he first acquiring the Duff's Muirton estate, then acquiring the Ballafiery estate, and all the area around the Royal Northern Infirmary, until eventually Alexander Matheson owned almost everything from the river to the canal. And he started setting about building his vision for Inverness. Alexander Ross started in 1863 by laying out the new streets that were going to form this part of the town. Started off in Tomnachurig Street. They demolished the old road. You may not appreciate it now or not know, but where the bridge crossed the river, it didn't continue into Tomnachurig Street as it does now. It just hit a wall of buildings, and there was another dense courtyard of tenements that sat at the end of the bridge. And to actually get out onto the road to the west was a bit of a detour around all of these little lanes to get out onto the road. Tomnachurig Street was a very narrow little lane with, again, vernacular broken down cottages with thatch. What Alexander Matheson was able to do in acquiring all of the land was he was able to widen Tomnachurig Street, to realign it, to line it up with the bridge, to give it much greater width, to give an approach that was going to be much more in keeping with his vision for the town. And he set out, again, all of these modern streets with a wonderful layout that reflected not only the riverside, but also linking back over to Telford Street. All the red that you can see are buildings by Alexander Ross. Stretching over a 20-year period from 1864 to 1884. You can see that this is his vision. These are the buildings that are documented and recorded. He did many more of the houses along Greg Street and Duncraig Street, and the little lanes around the back of Mill Lead Street. And the names all come from Alexander Matheson's family. So Ardross Street refers to the Ardross Castle, where the family were. Duncraig Castle was Alexander Matheson's castle in Plockton, where he ran his West Coast estates. Greg Street, John Gregg was the factor for Alexander Matheson's estates. We have a Mary Ann Court, that's Alexander Ross's wife. We have Kenneth Street, that was Alexander Matheson's son. So all of the names are tied to Alexander Matheson in one way or the other. There's a beautiful progression in scale of buildings as we move around the Ardross Street quarter. Starting off with the small little gateway he made at the end of Kenneth Street, with these two matching blocks of houses that bring us through to Kenneth Street, where we have these small, these would be houses for smaller tradesmen, smaller professionals, smaller middle class people. They give much more dignity. If you can remember the picture of Chisholm's Court with the thatch and the hanging lump. Well, these were modern houses for the new generation of Inverness people. You can look at the space, the width, the light. They have a little garden at the front to give them a little bit of space and privacy, but they're still built with a sense of proportion, a composition that has scale and refinement and beauty. They grow in scale and stature from small semi-detached houses to detached houses. And this is Ardross Street, and you can see that they're gradually getting grander and grander as we move around the quarter, getting closer to the cathedral. And this is the block of townhouses that faces the cathedral, and then we turn the corner and we start moving in along the riverside. We set off with this beautiful little French Renaissance tower in the corner that sets off the cathedral, also by Ross in the background. And we walk along the riverside, and again we find lots of beautiful detail. The bear and the unicorn that sit on top of Ardross Terrace, the unicorn being the national emblem for Scotland, and the bear being the emblem for the Matheson clan, which comes from the Gaelic, from the Bears, the family from the Bears. And then we come round to this wonderful block at the end of Bridge Street. Quite a intriguing building. It's got so much poetry. There's so much going on there. The design and the composition are beautiful, but then there's poetry and symbolism. So while the centre of the town was about business and classical, rational thought, cold decision making, the west side of the river was about poetry. It was about the picturesque. It was about the romance. It was all about giving a sense of place and identity about what the Highlands were about. So Alexander Ross has this audacious idea of let's stick a tower house in the middle of Inverness. But it's not just any old tower house. It's the crescendo to a whole, everything along the riverside and along Ardross Terrace and along Ardross Street has been building up to this project. You can see if you look at the scale of the buildings as we move up, they gradually grow and getting bigger and bigger and bigger until we get to the bridge itself, where we cross the river from the town centre and we head west to the Highlands and the mountains of the west. This is how it looked when it first opened. And we can see this beautiful decoration, this wonderful arched entrance on the opening. Unfortunately, the rock pool's signage kind of conceals an awful lot of this beautiful stonework that is there. But it is still, even in its current state, it's a remarkable building. And it does this trick that Alexander Ross has, where he doesn't design each face of the building as if you were just going to look at the building face on all the time. Ross understands that you move around the building. The building sits in the landscape and it's always changing. Your perspective is always different, whether you're looking at it from one side of the river or from the other side of the river, whether you're coming up Young Street. And the building wraps around. The whole design is continuous right the way around in 360 degrees. And when you open up the facade, so we have Ness Walk on this side, on the riverside, and we have Young Street on this side, we find that this defensive Highland Tower House turns into this beautiful Scottish Renaissance townhouse with the centre block and the two wings on either side. Alexander Matheson, his client, was very much part of this team in terms of how the whole west side of the river turned out. He had his own views, and he gave an address where he expounded on them. He said, "Our country is gradually becoming the autumn residence of the noble and the wealthy of the land, from the Queen on the throne to the coal and the iron masters of the south and the manufacturers of Lancashire and Glasgow. They come among us in increasing numbers every year. They spend their money freely and are, in general, liberal with those with whom they employ. For my part, I believe we cannot see too many of them, and that it is in our interest, as well as our duty, to make our country as agreeable to them as we can. It is also a sign of progress to see the handsome buildings springing up in and around the town, including the new seminaries of education that are being formed. I have long thought and often expressed the opinion that Inverness is specially adapted to be made a desirable residence for families of moderate fortune who have children to educate and desire to live in a beautiful country and a healthy climate, and to this nothing can tend more than the establishment of good schools. I do not think that manufacturers can ever flourish here to any great extent. We are too far from the materials, with the exception of coal, and the markets are too distant. In short, I would greatly prefer to see the capital of the Highlands a pleasant residence for retired civilians and officers of the army with first-class schools rather than a manufacturing town." And this is very much the vision for the west side of the river. Alexander Ross sticking another couple of caricatures onto his buildings. These are on the corner of Nesswalk, so if you want to look out for them, they're on the little bay window right at the top. So anybody who remembers the Muppets will remember Waldorf and Stadler commenting on passers-by heading east or west into Inverness. I've barely scraped the surface of what he's done just in Inverness, let alone the rest of the Highlands. He was truly prolific, but he was also incredibly modest. He was aware of the very precarious position he was in when he started his business, and he was very aware of all the friendship and help that he got from the community as he built up his business. He went from being an orphan with very few prospects to becoming a businessman, to becoming the provost of the town leader, and he set up, or helped to set up, organisations like the Inverness Field Club. He was very instrumental in the running of the Mechanics Institute because he felt passionately about giving young apprentices and people of lower working classes the opportunity to learn and to develop their skills and to improve themselves. And to go full circle, to return back to William MacDonald's address from 1904, where he compared Alexander Ross to Christopher Wren. Ross's response was, "When I heard your chairman's flattering remarks, I began to wonder to whom he referred. I felt it must be someone far different from me, and but for his assurance, I think I might have failed to recognise myself. My idea of one's merits never soared so high as your chairman's, and we must allow a large margin for his warmth, friendship, and Celtic imagination." Before I finish, I want to reflect on some of the things that have happened to his buildings since that time. This is the Inverness Cathedral as it would have been in 1904, when Alexander Ross was in the twilight of his career. It had this beautiful flesh in the centre of the roof, and all of this wonderful decoration on every buttress and every pinnacle. It was rippling in texture and beauty. In the 1960s, the flesh was removed and it was replaced with what probably seemed at the time like something very modern. The aesthetic doesn't work. We've lost a lot of the detail that once adorned all of the little corners, and you'll see the decorative ridge line. If I just step back, you see this wonderful, wonderful feathery edge along the ridge. All of this decoration that really helped give lightness to the building and made it sing. And all of this, over time, was gradually eroded away. It's been taken away for safety reasons and not replaced, and it's just been left rather bare and naked. The Tweedmouth Memorial Chapel, further up the river beside the Royal Northern Infirmary. This beautiful multi-denominational church that would function for Roman Catholics, Episcopalians and Presbyterians all together, so that the patients in the hospital, if they weren't able to go to church, were able to come here and celebrate their faith. Sadly today, the flesh is gone, the crosses on the gables are all gone, and it's looking slightly sad. Bishop Eden's School. This is just off the slide that I showed you of the west side of the river. You can see the wonderful Gothic windows that once adorned the gable have been broken out, and these horrible square PVC windows have gone back in its place. You can see just the outline of the Gothic windows going up the gable. The bell coat has been removed. Piece by piece, the building is being stripped of all its wonderful decoration and is the shadow of its former self. The public hall, the fire in the 1960s, being demolished, and this is what stands there now. Can you imagine that wonderful balcony that once stood there with VIPs swinging open the doors and addressing the crowd outside? It would have been absolutely wonderful. The Caledonian Hotel. Dear, dear. Yeah, probably seemed like a good idea at the time. And you have one of the prime sites overlooking the river. Why would you do that? Anyway, and coming a little bit closer to where we are today, the British Linen Bank. This is how it would have looked when it opened. Look, it's all gone. 1930s windows have gone in, the shop fronts, the ground floor has all been stripped. All to make it, give it as big display windows to show their products as possible, but in the same time, they've made everything that is attractive about the high street disappear. Yeah, this is one of the blocks down at the entrance to Tomnahurra Street. The block of shops on the right-hand side, thankfully, retains its character. This one, they've made a half-hearted. There was a really horrible bank frontage on this. They've made a half-hearted attempt to restore it with this little arch thing across the door. It's a shadow of its former self. But it's not all bad news. This was the Colombo Hotel only a couple of years ago. They've taken away the horrible balconies and they've revealed Alexander Ross's wonderful ironwork that adorned the front of this building. And I'm hoping that they will continue to restore it and keep it, because it is much more attractive than what was there before. This wonderful building here, which was supported by Inverness City Heritage Trust. It was saved. Can you imagine what might have happened to it if WASPs hadn't come in here, and if Inverness City Heritage Trust and all the other organisations in Inverness hadn't rallied round to do something with it? It's full of wonderful detail, beautifully coloured stone that gives this sense of depth and texture to the building, and this wonderful, delightful sculptural reveals at the top of the windows. And a wonderful cafe too. So, as Jean said, there's a lot to be done to understand exactly how important our heritage is, just what an impact people like Alexander Ross made and the legacy that they've given us. I could sit here and talk all night, tomorrow night, the night after that, all different aspects of his remarkable life. But today we focused on Inverness, which was the place that he loved and the town that loved him back. Thank you. Yes. I will go back. It is with the printers, and I'm waiting for the date for delivery. So it should be with us in October, just in time for Christmas.